Rav Hildesheimer.
Yes.
Okay, so let's begin with something. Just look at this man and let's travel to 2009. I don't want to pull it up, but in 2009, you can go Google this, something quite astounding happened in the city of Berlin. A rabbinical seminary opened, or should I say it reopened, with the financial help of the Lauder Foundation. The seminary that we began just to touch on last week towards the end, and Hildesheimer, that was closed since by the Nazis around Kristallnacht and stayed closed until 2009. And around 2014, I don't remember the actual number of students, but they actually ordained students at this seminary, fully Orthodox, committed, wonderful young people from across Europe. So it was a course celebrating the Jewish world, but no one really knew and understood the depth of how important the reopening of that seminary was. It now is actually feeding, what should I say, the rabbis across Europe, you name it, from Russia, Hungary, et cetera, Germany, obviously. And thank God it's doing very well. But the background of that seminary goes back to this person that we spoke about. And let's lay the background one more time. We today, in 2020, whatever it is, can speak of Judaism with a number of, what should I call them? Under the umbrella of Judaism, you can find Orthodoxy, Hasidic, Reform, traditional, Reconstructionist, whatever you want. For a movement to survive, and we said this last time, it can only survive as long as its rabbinical school is providing students needed to pass on the message. Take the rabbinical school away, it might be a school of Judaism or of ideas, but not one that allows the movement to continue. Now, Rav Ettlinger, if you remember, one of the teachers of Rabbi Hildesheimer, wanted to establish such a seminary, but was not successful. Now, Hildesheimer, again, having come under the influence of Chacham Bernays, as did Rav Hirsch, wants to continue this particular idea of his Rebbe. Now, in 1851, Hildesheimer becomes the rabbi in the city of Eisenstadt. At that point, Eisenstadt was in Hungary. Today, it's in Austria. So here is this well-educated, and again, to remind ourselves, Rav Azriel Hildesheimer, a Talmid Chacham first rate, without a question, super well-versed in Greek literature, Josephus, Latin, who had gone to 3 different universities, really an impressive human being, comes to Eisenstadt and establishes, with the help of some people, a Bet Midrash of sorts, which is a seminary. He wants to teach there secular studies, but not just secular studies on a high level. Not what we would call today secular studies in a high school, which is okay. Is it high level? Is college a high level? Okay. We can debate what is high level and what is not, but this is the rigor of Europe. People needed to know more than one language, of course, the classics, humanities. And lo and behold, he tries to do it. And some rather prominent people actually send their kids there, knowing very well that Rav Hildesheimer will teach Gemara in the morning and then at 10 o'clock for an hour, he'll read the Greek classics. And it was required for all. Our Jewish world, you know how it works. The Amkshe Oref. The minute everything is working, there's someone else who doesn't like what you're doing. And of course, there are critics right away. As hard as he tries, Rav Hildesheimer is not very successful. Yes, students come and the school is growing, but he's not able to pull off the dream of what he wanted. The criticism that he was getting from the Hasidic group, if you want, the Hungarian Rabbanim, just he didn't want to get into a machloket, into a fight, even though he wrote about it. And fast forward, not long after he's not sure what he wants to do, in the early 1860s, the son of the Chassam Sofer, the Ksav Sofer, approaches him with the idea of come to Pressburg, where the yeshiva of the Chassam Sofer was now being led by his son, the Ksav Sofer, come and establish together with me a school like you wanted to build in Eisenstadt. And he's thinking about it, but the word gets out and pressure is applied on the Ksav Sofer, do not do this, don't bring secular studies here, not on that level, and the idea is abandoned. So in 1873, when finally, by then, he had come back to Germany in the city of Berlin, Rav Azriel Hildesheimer opens the Rabbinische school of the seminary that he wanted. If we would read what was required for someone to enter this particular rabbinical seminary, you would be astounded. It's not like I went to high school, I'm going to the Bet Midrash to learn. There were rigorous tests of entrance. You had to really know your stuff. And he only wanted students, obviously committed students, but students who had gone through a very rigorous secular studies, who understood the humanities well, and at the end, they'll be committed to Torah and the truth of Torah. In a term not yet in usage, surely not in a popular way, in the way we would speak of orthodoxy today. And hopefully today I'll come to the orthodoxy term. And this seminary, when we look at his speech, the one that he makes the first day at its opening, it was October 22nd, Rav Hildesheimer, in perfect high German, and of course, by now, many of the Rabbanim in Germany will speak German. Not everybody yet, but it's pretty clear. You want to succeed, the only option you have is German. The ideals that he had, that this institution will absolutely not be a factory for rabbis. That's not what we're intending. He wanted it to become a center where, and he says it straight out in his speech, where everyone in the Jewish world, from the grocer to the painter, Jews of all kinds, would strive to sit and engage knowledge in general, of course, with the emphasis on the rabbinic knowledge, because it was a rabbinical school. And he succeeds. And in his speech, he uses the words that we discussed last time quite openly, without any fear. Das Wissenschaft von Judentum, the science of Judaism, that had started with people like Zunz, Steinschneider, etc. Geiger, of course. And he's not afraid of the term. He embraces it. Now, he does realize, and I mentioned this a little bit last time, but now, let me see if I can share this with you. Okay, this is Zachariah Frankel. Now, Zachariah Frankel, and you can see from his picture, traditional, definitely a traditional person who you would label not probably Orthodox today, or maybe you would. And it's part of the issue that we will be having, because he keeps Torah and mitzvot to every detail. An observant fellow who becomes the first rector of that other seminary in Breslau. Also training rabbis, but rabbis who were meant to be more enlightened, who now Hildesheimer understands that if his seminary will in any way, shape, or form not come up to the rigorous learning and serious historical inquiry that that other seminary has, his seminary will not be around for long. And it's a challenge, he knows. And in his speech, he actually says, we will have, obviously, a commitment to the Sinaitic covenant of Torah, but we will, with an open mind, not be afraid to look at the ideas of what historically we are now beginning to examine and study, this Wissenschaft das Judentum. Now, this Zachariah Frankel, born in 1801, died in around 1875, not too much after the Hildesheimer Seminary had opened, had written a number of books. His first book, we'll come back to it because of Rav Hirsch, was entitled, and it's a fabulous book, called Darchei HaMishnah v'HaTosefta v'HaMechilta. It is the first open historical inquiry into the history of the Mishnah, the Tosefta, all these rabbinic works. And he examined them with the intention of, like, is there development there? Can we see it's looked at it this way in this century by these Tanaim, and later we see that they look at it very differently, et cetera, et cetera. The key word here is development. Can we see that happening? And clearly, he comes to a pretty clear conclusion that yes, within rabbinical literature, there is growth from generation to generation. People add, people reinterpret, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, there are historical conclusions based on that. Maybe, when did we think something was edited? Well, it was done by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the Mishnah. Was every single Mishnah edited by him? Were statements in the Mishnah added later? Well, let's examine it. And of course, the answer is yes. And in the Darchei HaMishnah, Zachariah Frankel goes to prove it, Mishnah after Mishnah, Tosefta, et cetera, et cetera. Keep this person in mind. So now Hildesheimer builds the seminary, it succeeds. One of the people he brings in, and we'll discuss some more next week, and we spoke of him quickly, was the young fellow who had also come from Eisenstadt to Germany and got a job as a teacher in Rav Hirsch's school, Rabbi David Zvi Hoffman, who described last week the idea that he walked in there with his hat or his yarmulke, and Rav Hirsch told him, sorry, when we do limudei chol here, first of all, when you greet a person, you take off your hat. It would seem extremely not nice if any of the non-Jews would see you do that. And he was shocked, coming from a culture where the kippah or the yarmulke or the hat never comes off. He's shocked, and he records it, and that's in his. So Hildesheimer hires Rabbi David Zvi Hoffman, who eventually will become the posek in Germany for the next generation. And he'll teach Bible there. Now we'll come back to Rav Hoffman, or Hoffman as they call him, for very important reasons. And let me back it up the other way. I'm going to make a statement that might seem very strange to you today, but if you bear with this series, by the time we'll get there, and you remember it all without a test or a review, well, maybe I'll review a drop. This will become super important because it's an issue of contention today in modern Orthodoxy. Bible criticism. I don't know how familiar you are with it, but in the Orthodox world today, can an Orthodox Jew study Bible criticism? Bible criticism, as its name implies, without getting into the details of it, at least not for now, is an inquiry into the actual text of the Torah itself. To give it to you in short, coming out of Germany in the second half of the 1800s, there were major challenges proposed by a fellow who becomes famous, but he's not the beginner of this, or surely not the end, Wellhausen. Wellhausen had a number of very serious questions about the text of the Torah. Why does God have so many different names, et cetera, et cetera? And he came up with very serious challenges. Now, do we study these things, or Tanakh is off the table? The written law we don't touch, rabbinic law we could look into. The reason I bring it up is because Rav Hoffman was not afraid, and we'll discuss this, coming out of the seminary and teaching in this seminary, to deal with the issues that Bible criticism in his days, in fact, Wellhausen himself, had raised, and wrote quite well and powerfully and successfully against this idea, not just because, dogmatically I have to believe in this, but I can't prove it. No, Rav Hoffman went ahead and did that. And this breakup, which I'm now jumping into, between Rav Hirsch and Hildesheimer, where Rav Hildesheimer embraced das Wissenschaft, das Judentum. He embraced serious inquiry into whatever it is. You believe Torah to be true, then you know what? I'm not afraid of anything. I will figure out how it works. I don't have to compromise on my principles if I really believe it. Of course, getting into the details at the end of the day, belief in a religion is faith. It's not a question of proving it or not proving it. All of it will eventually collapse into faith. But if I have the faith, then I should find an answer. And the reason I bring it up is because modern Orthodoxy today is literally dealing with this issue as the hottest burning issue on such a interesting front. And with Hashem's help, we'll get there. But now, let me just actually pull it up because I had it out of David Ellison's book from last time. I have a screenshot that puts it all together for us. Let me just open it up. And here's that book that I showed you last time. Rabbi Azriel Hildesheimer and the Creation of Modern Jewish Orthodoxy. Okay. You should see it on your screen in about 30 seconds or less. Okay. Straight out of his book. Let's read it. The tale of the modern Jewish Orthodox response to the changing society of the 19th century Germany has often been told through the life and works of Rav Hirsch. Yet, modern Jewish Orthodoxy had other exponent men whose vision of modern Orthodoxy diverged from Hirsch's in several ways. Please remember this. Rabbi Azriel Hildesheimer of Berlin championed an enterprise that Rav Hirsch rejected, das Wissenschaft des Judentums, the painstaking academic study of Jewish sources. Hildesheimer was the founder of the Rabbinic Seminary in Berlin in 1873, which they were studying critical study of Jewish sources, combined with an allegiance to the principles of the Torah, both written and oral, are a direct revelation from the mouth of the Almighty. And that is the point of this break that will become extremely important in the development of modern Orthodoxy, and it affects us today. And whatever it is, it's these two forces being rehashed, maybe with different words and different ideas, between Rav Hirsch and Hildesheimer, or between our Orthodoxy today. So keep that in mind. So now let's go the other way. We have spoken of Rav Hirsch, but we've said so little about what this man did, except we read, if you remember, Hermann Schwab's description of memories that he had as a child of Rav Hirsch, and of course from his father. One of the things described in there, if you remember, was the banner that the school had, where in 1859, which was 100 years after the birth of a very famous poet of Germany, Friedrich Schiller. Now, I don't know how much you know about German poetry, and not that I'm an expert in it, God forbid, but Schiller's poetry is really touching. And we have today, thanks to the scholarship of Mark Shapiro, published in, let's make sure it's in the right one, in volume 15, and look at the title, because we'll come to this. Yeshiva University for a while had a publication entitled the Torah Umada Journal, an annual devoted to the interaction between Judaism and general culture. Now, why did Yeshiva University in our time period decide to publish these annually? But there's an article in here by Mark Shapiro where he actually got a hold of the speech that Rav Hirsch made on the 100-year anniversary of the birth of Friedrich Schiller, and he made it in the shul school where Rav Hirsch had now been the rabbi for 8 years. He had come to Frankfurt in 1851. This is November 9th. Now, all of Germany on this day was celebrating the birth 100 years earlier of Friedrich Schiller. Friedrich Schiller died in 1805. He was good friends with Goethe, if you know a little bit about German poetry, etc. And his speech begins like this. Now, here is an Orthodox rabbi. If this genius would step into our midst, whose legacy we are celebrating today, then the wisdom of our fathers would instruct us to greet him with Baruch Shenatan Michochmato Lebasar B'dam, the bracha that we make when we see someone who's not Jewish, who has chokhmah. And then he goes and he sings the praises of Schiller. And therefore, for sure, the Chachamim would call his human wisdom given to him by God, mechochmato. Who could be more worthy than of this welcome than Schiller? At this moment, this man whom Germany so proudly calls her Schiller is celebrated all over the world, where our native tongue is understood, where German soul and spirit are manifest. And he goes on, quoting in German lines of this poetry. Now, the poetry of Schiller is indeed moving. It's a very spiritual type of poetry. It makes you think about life, gives life meaning. This is not one of those poems that you might remember if you were here. I don't know how many series back when we discussed the poetry of the great rabbis, quotation, of Spain in the Golden Age, where they were singing poetry of trees, or what they called Shirei Yayin, very secular poetry, but it was in Hebrew. This Schiller was not that. Now, imagine how we have to understand the subtleties here. Here is Rav Hirsch, who deeply is committed to Torah and mitzvot, and how deeply I'll explain in a minute, who was able to rebuild this community that was ravaged by the reform movement into a strong, powerful kehillah, almost like a miracle, but he did it. Who is absolutely in awe of German culture, of Germany, of the language. And as we saw last week, students were reading Greek, they were reading the classics, and an outsider was astounded that this was going on. Yet, the same Rav Hirsch, who was so open to this, was opposed to the notion of Wissenschaft as Judentum. He was not at all happy with it, and I'll get to that in a minute. But Rav Hirsch's first work that he wrote, which was not published as his first work, and I'm sure you have it. If you don't have it, you should buy it. It is an amazing piece of work. It's the very famous Chorev of Rav Hirsch. Chorev, Rav Hirsch, I'll give you, it's a philosophy of Jewish laws and observances, where if you know nothing about being Jewish, if you pick up this book, it becomes the most comprehensive guide, even to this day for many, of Judaism, literally in every little detail. There's a section on the Haggadah Shel Pesach. Now you know what the Haggadah is. On Sukkot, on Hanukkah, on the laws of Shabbos. Now notice he called it Chorev. Chorev is Har Sinai. And Rav Hirsch had this notion of the two mountains in the Jewish world. There's Har HaMoriah, where God tests Abraham, and there's the God that comes to the mountain of Chorev, who gives us the Torah. Taking the ideas of both the commitment of someone like Abraham and the commitment of the Jewish people of Har Sinai, Rav Hirsch blends together his idea of commitment to Torah and mitzvot, yet be totally engaged with the world in a concept that we call Torah im derech eretz. So what I would love to do is discuss this just a little bit, okay? So we'll come to the Torah im derech eretz. Let me just discuss Chorev. This is the first book he writes. He sends it off to a friend who is supposed to take it to the publisher. The book is close to about 600 pages. Here's an unknown author who has written this voluminous something. It's quite an expense to publish this book and then for it to be a failure. So his friend writes him back, what you should really do is maybe condense the book in a smaller book. And if that book sells and the publisher makes money, again, it's always about money, then we'll go ahead and publish this work. So Rav Hirsch, within about a year, produces an amazing piece of work, which he writes second, but gets published first, the very famous 19 Letters of Ben Uziel. The 19 Letters of Ben Uziel are a very, what should I call them? The essays in here, but let me explain to you how he set this book up. It was brilliant. It gets eventually to be called the Moreh Nevuchim of that particular century. It was a guide for the confused. Now, Rav Hirsch did not use his name when he wrote this book. No one knew it was him. He called himself Ben Uziel, written and published by Ben Uziel. You have no idea who he was? Okay, people bought the book. The book begins, interestingly, with the following words. First letter, there are 19 letters in here. My dear Naphtali, when recently we met again writes this fellow's name is Benjamin, after many years of separation, you do not imagine what interest the subject of our conversation had for me. You, Naphtali, found me, Benjamin, so different, so changed in my religious views and practices that despite your usual tolerance, you couldn't help asking yourself, since when and why? I answered you with a whole series of accusations against Judaism based upon my reading and coming in contact with the world since I left my home and parents. In other words, the 19 letters of Rav Hirsch are a document of exchange of letters where this fellow Benjamin, who had been a good friend of Naphtali's, had gone to school together, had learned in the same yeshiva, but went off, as we say today, off the derech, and for good reason, and with a disdain and almost a disappointment in Judaism. Now, living in Germany in this particular time period, it is easy to understand as much as it is easy to understand today, when people are so into the culture that their own culture becomes almost like nonsensical. And what do I have to do all this? It's so limiting. One day a week I can't work, certain foods I can't eat. So what Rav Hirsch did in this book, which was astounding, again, he's making it all up, but it really dealt with the issues that the young and not so young Jews in Germany were having. And this Benjamin posed roughly about 19 questions, and Rav Hirsch goes to answer them. And each letter, you asked me about this, let me tell you about this. You asked me about the oral law, here is how this works. The book became an instant bestseller. And because it became a bestseller, the publisher, about a year and a half later, published Chorev, which again became a bestseller. Now, the 19 letters of En Uziel, people had no idea who wrote them. Who is this person? Rav Hirsch? One person who figured it out was his old buddy, who by now had really separated from him big time, but still had his respect. That was Abraham Geiger, who many will call the first Reform Rabbi, one of the important members of Wissenschaftas Judentum. He was so not in agreement with this book because his view of Judaism was so different that he had to review it, mind you, and this is in an indirect praise to Rabbi Hirsch, in 4 different articles in the monthly periodical of the Breslau Seminary. And he does realize who wrote it. And in his 4th article about it, because he says, this book is written so well and so convincing, even though I don't agree with my good old friend from years ago. Now, if you remember, they had learned Zvachim together, at least tractate the Gemara Zvachim years earlier, and had been in university together, Geiger and Hirsch, but they've gone their own ways. By now, Abraham Geiger had said things like tefillin. Oh, that's like an outdated amulet you wrap around your hand and you put on your head. That's not like a thing to do anymore. And of course, there was criticism because the people understood that the criticism which was labeled towards Rav Hirsch basically was telling them that this man had succeeded. And suddenly, Rav Hirsch became Rav Hirsch. And of course, 1851, fast forward, he comes to Frankfurt, and it's here that emblazoned on the cornerstone of the school is this phrase, Torah im derech eretz. Torah im derech eretz. So let's explain what this is. And I would ask you, how many times do you think Rav Hirsch mentions this idea that we give him so much credit for in both of these books put together? And you realize I'm setting you up. Derech Eretz is not mentioned once, not here and not here. In fact, Rav Hirsch never actually sat down to write an essay called Toram Derech Eretz. And therefore, what is the Toram Derech Eretz of Rav Hirsch? So let me show you how this is a question, because here is a person to whom we attribute a movement, Toram Derech Eretz, who you can't say, oh, he discussed it there, there's like 5-10 pages of it, or he wrote an article. He never did. Yet, it was on the banner that the school carried to every one of its convocations, every graduation, every time there was something important, the banner of Toram Derech Eretz was there. It couldn't enter the building without seeing Toram Derech Eretz. Everyone heard this phrase. So let me share a number of things with you. But before we share what I really want to get to, let me share something else just to show you and give you a flavor of the way Rav Hirsch writes. And you'll begin to understand how powerful and how meaningful his words became to the Jews of Frankfurt initially and then spreading throughout Germany. So here are his 3 pictures of him. Here is Rav Hirsch in his 30s. Here's almost in his 60s, and here's Rav Hirsch towards the end of his life. Okay, but let me read with you something else. Okay, let me just get rid of this one. Let me go find the other one. Okay, there it is. Okay, here is his commentary to the Kumash. Now, his commentary to the Kumash, like everything we're looking in English, or if you're lucky to see it in Hebrew or in Spanish or in French, he wrote in German. On the verse where Torah speaks of Yaakov and Esav having grown up, and each one ended up to be very different, Rav Hirsch says the following: our sages who never objected to draw attention to the small and great mistakes and weaknesses in the history of our great forefathers, and thereby make them just the more instructive for us. Point is that the parents here did not do a great job in raising these 2 children. And Rav Hirsch goes on, each child must be treated differently, with an eye to the slumbering tendencies of his nature. And out of them, be educated to develop his special characteristics for the one pure human and Jewish life. Okay? And then he says it again, right here. Had Isaac and Rebekah studied Esav's nature and character early enough and asked themselves, how can even an Esav, how can all the strength and energy, agility and courage that lies slumbering in this child be won over to be used in the service of God? And therefore, Rav Hirsch's notion is, and he was a great educator. Every child is different. And being in education now for 4,000 years, Rav Hirsch's comments were almost prophetic. How many times do we look at our children, oh, we pass them through similar institutions of learning but you know what, one kid's different. This kid doesn't need this. This kid needs that. Because, says Rav Hirsch, of a paragraph that I skipped over, the Jewish people are not all supposed to be the same. This cookie cutter idea The Jewish nation, says Rav Hirsch, has to be soldiers. There have to be doctors. There have to be teachers. There have to be lawyers. And we have to figure out early in life what every child is good at and use it that way. And therefore, let's try to figure it out. And don't just put them all together and all children are the same, because by the time we discover it, it might already be too late. Now, notice he was not afraid to criticize the Avot themselves. Wait a second, you're talking about the Avot Ha'am here. Rav Hirsch had no fear in that sense to criticize literally anybody. In fact, in a line in the 19 letters, which gets censored in some editions, so you always have to find a good edition of the 19 letters, he actually criticizes the Rambam. And he criticizes Mendelssohn, with whom he had many disagreements, of course, not in person, even though he admired Mendelssohn in a certain way, and of course, deeply respected the Rambam. But he made a comment that is Moshe ben Maimon and Moshe ben Mendel similar to Moshe ben Amram. That line you might not see in all editions. What he meant was the Rambam came to his philosophy through Greek philosophy of Aristotle. He felt a challenge. He accepted much of Greek philosophy and made Torah fit to Aristotle. And Rav Hirsch was not very happy with that. Torah itself should inspire you. You have to find everything out of the sources of Judaism. And the secular stuff is supposed to enhance you understand Torah better. So now what is this idea of Torah derech eretz? So going back, actually, I don't need to go back. I have it here too. Hold on. So notice where we are. In Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, Rav Hirsch, where Torah speaks of the derech eitz hachayim, it speaks of 26 generations, quoting a Chazal. 26 generations did derech eretz before Torah. And what is derech eretz? He translates it here. The way is culture. Culture starts the work of educating generations of mankind. And later on, 26 generations later, the Torah completes it. For the Torah is the most finished education for man. So the fig leaf and the apron described here in Bereshit, those first gifts which man possessed on his way to education, are the beginning of culture. And culture in the service of morality is the first stage of man's return to God. For us Jews, derech eretz and Torah are one. The most perfect gentleman and the most perfect Jew to the Jewish teachings are identical. Skipping a little bit. This is why the Jew rejoices whenever and wherever culture elevates people to a perception of true values and to nurture goodness. And then those two sources that I've just seen you were culled and put together in a long article that Rav Hirsch's great-grandson, the very famous Mordechai Breuer. Now, the legacy of Rav Hirsch, which we'll discuss not so much now, but when we start with God's help later, after the Chagim, after Sukkot Chagim, if Beth Jacob still wants to host these series, we'll come back to it. Because what happens to the legacy of Rav Hirsch, it gets captured and it gets taken away by different people who explain it differently. So Mordechai Breuer had written an article. Now, let me explain what Mordechai Breuer is and how Breuer gets into the family. Rav Hirsch himself had 10 children. One of his daughters, whose Hebrew name was Tzipporah, her name was Sophie, married a Shlomo Zalman Breuer. Shlomo Zalman Breuer was a Rav in the city of Pupa, if you know the Pupa Tzelem Hasidim, same city. And this couple, the Breuers, themselves had, I forget, about 8 children. And in this lineage of the Breuers are 2 Mordechai Breuers, first cousins to each other. One was the son of Shlomo Breuer. Shlomo Breuer had a son, Mordechai Breuer, who became the famous Mordechai Breuer, who was a great Tanakh scholar, who died, I believe, in February of 2007. An amazing scholar. Will come back to him because he plays a very important role in modern Orthodoxy and especially in Tanakh. And then his first cousin, the son of Isaac Breuer, Isaac Breuer's son, Isaac Breuer himself, a great Jewish philosopher, had made Aliyah. That branch of the family made Aliyah, which is a little bit in contrast to Rav Hirsch, not really for now, but Rav Hirsch was not a great believer in the concept of Zionism. In fact, to this day, if you have nothing to do, to this day means about 2 years ago when I last checked it, but I'm sure it's up there on the Natura Carta website. They promptly display Rav Hirsch as an anti-Zionist, of course, because he was not he believed in the land of Israel, don't get me wrong, but the idea of Zionism as political Zionism, Rav Hirsch was very much opposed to. Rav Hildesheimer was not. And it's another difference between these two, but that's for a future discussion. So imagine for a second, this Torah Derech Eretz, where does it come from? So Mordechai Breuer, the historian, well, again, both of them died a few months of each other, both Mordechai Breuers, wrote an article trying to figure out his great-grandfather's legacy. He says, nowhere did Rav Hirsch write about it. I think it's hinted to here in Bereshit. And then, let me see if I can actually, if I still have that page here. If not, I'll read it to you orally. I mean, not orally, but from a different document. Okay, so it's not here, so bear with me. It's in the, let me stop the sharing. It's in Rav Hirsch's Pirkei Avot. In Pirkei Avot, where the phrase actually appears. Again, Derech Eretz appears in Chazal many times. And in the 2nd chapter of Pirkei Avot, Mishnah Bet, Rabban Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, said, Yafeh Talmud Torah im Derech Eretz. Yafeh Talmud Torah im Derech Eretz. To give you the translation done here from the German, the study of Torah together with an occupation is an excellent thing. Here, Rav Hirsch says the term Derech Eretz indicates all the situations arising from and dependent upon the circumstance that the earth is the place where the individual must live, fulfill his destiny, dwell together with others, that he may utilize his resources and conditions provided on earth in order to live and accomplish his purpose. And he goes literally through all the things about culture, business, occupational activities, wisdom of humanity. All this is part of the idea of Derech Eretz. And again, to him, it was not like Torah Umada, which is, again, we'll come to that. This is not Torah v'derech eretz. This is Torah im derech eretz. Together, they complement each other. You cannot have only Torah, and you cannot only have Derech Eretz. On the other hand, another person very important in the German community was Rav Schwab. Rav Schwab felt that the best place where we can actually find the concept of Rav Hirsch is from a statement. Let me just find it. It's from here. Rav Hirsch in Vayikra, in Perek Yud Chet, it's chapter 18, verse, I think, 24. Quotes a Torah Kohanim, where the pasuk says, "La'lechet bahem." So let's go through the English. The aim of your endeavors shall be in them. They shall be your goal, the absolute, and shall not become secondary or conditional. Talking about Torah here. Your mind should absorb them, create through them. You shall not mix them with alien matter. You should not say to yourself, I have already learned Jewish knowledge. Shelo Tomar, don't say, I already learned Chochmat Israel. I'll now go and learn Chochmot Umot HaOlam. Talmud Lomar, La'lechet Bahem. Therefore it says, La'lechet Bahem, you must not depart from their sphere. Now listen to what he says. It appears in the opening statement here of this Torah Kohanim. Make them ikar and don't make them tafel is designed to keep us from misunderstanding. Says Rav Hirsch, we should not understand from the subsequent sentence of the statement that we must completely ignore all knowledge gained from non-Jewish sources, that we must abstain from any knowledge that has no direct bearing on Torah. For the words, make them ikar, make them the important one, don't make them secondary, implies that we are permitted to occupy ourselves with the other realms of knowledge also, only that we should make the Torah our principal concern, and the knowledge we gain from Torah should be regarded as absolute and unquestionable. The other disciplines are to be regarded as auxiliary. They're to be studied only if they are capable of aiding Torah study and subordinated to it between Ikar and Tafel. Torah truth must remain for us absolute and unconditional. Therefore, Torah is not to be considered the equivalent of the other sciences, as though Torah is just one branch of knowledge. So to Rav Hirsch, Torah im derech eretz meant literally Torah im derech eretz. Derech eretz means study secular knowledge. Use it in your, don't be afraid of it. It's not Torah only and it's not this only. It's Yafet, and of course there's a Mishnah later in Pirkei Avot, in the third chapter of Pirkei Avot, I think Mishnah Yud Zayin. If there's no derech eretz, there's no Torah. If there's no Torah, there's no derech eretz. You need them both. And therefore, Rav Hirsch, to be understood clearly, is not the idea of like, secular studies, for sure, just, no. Torah is the ikar. With this idea, we can maybe understand a drop more of why the concept of Wissenschaft als Judentum was not at all pleasant in Rav Hirsch's eyes. In a comment that he made to Geiger, he said the following: Mr. Geiger, you study the slichot. You can tell me when every one of the slichot was written, who wrote the slichot. You can tell me the rhyming meter of which poetry is being copied in each one of the slichot that we say on Yom Kippur or during Aseret Yomei Teshuvah. But Mr. Geiger, did you ever wake up at 6 a.m. in the morning or earlier to say the slichot? I'm not concerned about their history. I'm concerned about the practice of you waking up in the morning and saying it. That is my concern. What Wissenschaft das Judentum meant to Hirsch was that now Torah was going to become such an inquiry that we will forget its main purpose. Its main purpose was Lishmor Ulekayim. Now you're just going to study about it, and therefore you'll find maybe some flaw in it, and maybe because it's not perfectly understandable to you, or it was not the way you understood it, you might now discard it. This was Rav Hirsch. Now, what is interesting, and we'll see this much more as we go on, when our friend Zachariah Frankel published his Darchei HaMishnah, and here I have to give credit to an amazing publishing house that I'm not sure how it's doing today. I know it was in bankruptcy a couple of years back. And that's the publishing house of Feldenheim. Feldenheim Publishing, which started in this country in around 1939, actually, was Mr. Feldenheim had come from Vienna, had actually moved up to Washington Heights, and became a member of the Breuer Kehillah. At that point, it was actually still a son of Rav Hirsch who was running it, famous Yosef Breuer. And all of Rav Hirsch's works were published. I'll give them credit that they had the guts, nerve, and the bastion of, have you ever seen the collected writings of Rav Hirsch? People buy them as gifts. They're about 7 or 8 volumes. This is volume 5. You have nothing to do, pick it up. No one ever looks at it. It is, let me read it to you in the beginning. The origin of the oral law. And what does Rav Hirsch do here? At least what I'm concerned with right now. We'll do the rest next time. Articles on Dr. Zachariah Frankel's Darchei HaMishnah. And what did Rav Hirsch do? He was not very happy with the seminary in Breslau and this book by Zachariah Frankel, who he wouldn't dare attack as a person initially because he was viewed as a good Jew, but he taught in that other seminary. And now in this book, in the Darchei HaMishnah, a number of chapters Rav Hirsch felt were being Torah Shebal Peh, and its foundation were being threatened with that notion of development. And that is where Rav Hirsch began to write. The beauty of this edition is that in all the other articles in here, and I'll get to some next time, there has to be a background to the story. So now you will learn everything about the Darchei HaMishnah, and this becomes like, wait a second, I don't know if you should read that book. So volume 5 of the collecting writings of Rav Hirsch, not very, what should I tell you? I'm amazed that they actually did all that. And I know we are literally almost out of time. Give me 1 more minute. I got to share this one with you before we go. And this will be our entrance to next time. Rav Hirsch wrote the following, and it'll be thought for next time. We discussed so much the term Orthodox. In one of his essays, actually written against Geiger, the person who eulogizes orthodoxy, we, the so-called proponents of orthodoxy, who do not believe in the mission of the new prophet, as the black opponents of progress and civilization and of reform, etc. Wait, one of those fools be permitted in the face of such provocation and carefully considered objective remarks for the purpose of stating fully and placing in a true light the facts with which certain people are so glad to call religious confusion. At first point of fact, it was not Orthodox Jews who introduced the word orthodoxy into Jewish discussion. It was the modern progressive Jews who first applied this name to old backward Jews as a derogatory term. This name was at first resented by all Jews. Jews didn't like it, and rightfully so. Orthodox Judaism does not know any variety of Judaism. It conceives Judaism as one and indivisible. It does not know a Mosaic, prophetic, which came out of the Breslau Seminary, rabbinic Judaism, not Orthodox or liberal. It only knows Judaism. And therefore this term that we're bandying about, oh, I am Orthodox. This term started out, no one liked this term, no one wanted orthodoxy. It was so awkward to be called Orthodox. Today, okay, says Rav Hirsch, if that's what you want to call me, I'll accept it. But we're so proud of this. And of course, we now append to it modern Orthodox. Imagine almost how oxymoronic those two terms really are. Having said all that, I apologize for going over time. And with Hashem's help, next week, and if you have any questions, comments, I'll still stay on for a minute or two. If not, Laila Tov, everybody, as you're getting ready for Pesach, I'm sure.
Rabbi,
May I?
what is the name of Mordechai Breuer, the Tanakh specialist's father?
Shimshon.
Thank you.
Ayala, you had a question?
It's not a question, it's a comment, and it's very unusual when I think of it now. You were talking about Goethe and about Schiller, and my grandmother, Zichronah Livracha, was not a college-educated woman, was not, she didn't go to school, but she was very proud of the fact they were Orthodox. They were Mizrahi way back when.
Right.
Us survivors. She used to tell me that she learned Goethe and Schiller. I used to read it, and she knew German. And it's now that you're talking about it, and you're saying how Hirsch was so avid about talking about him, it makes me feel even more impressed that she had
That you knew it.
do it, right?
Yeah, you'd be surprised what that generation knew.
Not mistaken.
It's pretty amazing.
It was
If I'm
pretty
not
amazing.
mistaken- If I'm not mistaken, the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven incorporates the Schiller poem in the chorale.
No, Henry, you're never mistaken. Keep it up. And by the way, one of the people who criticized Rav Hildesheimer was that Hillel Mikalamai, together with Akiva Schlesinger.
Right.
They're the ones who gave him a hard time in Eisenstadt.
So two things. First of all, Rabbi Alan Schwartz was doing a thing for YU today. He quoted Rav Hirsch on pedagogy, which he had written into his Haggadah that Esav and Yaakov should have been raised differently. So he quoted that about 50 minutes ago. Not 50 now, an hour and a half ago. And
We were on the same wavelength.
so that was one. And the other thing is I heard a quote from someone from Hildesheimer, which apparently is across the street from the other seminary, from the Wissenschaft. So he said, what's the difference between the two? So the difference between the two is if you want to know what color jacket Rashi was wearing, you go there. If you want to know Rashi, you come here. That was
Yeah.
the quote. I heard that quote from Berlin.
Yeah, there are many lines like that. There are many lines like that.
Photo
Not,
Rab,
by the way, and I'll leave you with this. Rav Hirsch was not happy, as much as he respected Hildesheimer, he was not happy about that seminary either. And that caused a whole bunch of other issues, but we'll do that next time.
For the Rav, this question may be beyond the scope, but you did go out of your way to mention November 9th being the anniversary day of Schiller's death. Is there any connection to Kristallnacht? I realize that was, as a result of the, the actions in the Paris embassy by the Polish refugee. But any connection at all to did people beyond the scope?
Not that I'm aware of, Dr. Hershkowitz, not that I'm aware of, but many people have pointed that out. I have not seen it in print or anyone commenting on it. If it would be anyone who would comment on it, it might be the Breuers. I'll try to find out, but I don't know. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning from New York.
Good night. Yes. Good morning, New York, right?
Good night, everybody, wherever you're hanging out.